Okay, hello and welcome everybody to the closing session of En route to COP26. I'm Bronwyn Thornton. I'm the Chief Exec of Walk 21 and Chairwoman of the Slow Cat Partnership Board. I am honoured to chair this final session. I know it's been a stimulating, challenging few days, and it's lovely to now sit and bring it together into some coherent visions for the future. The Slow Cat Partnership is one of the 13 organizations that co-created En route to COP26. I must start my remarks today with a very, very big thank you to the team behind this extraordinary effort. And so my thanks and gratitude go to the Slow Cat team who have worked tirelessly over the last long while to bring you this event. But they are not the only ones making this effort. This event has been co-created and co-organized by an extraordinary collection of organizations, and it behoves me now to thank all of them. So this discussion with you all today, there's going to be quite a few lists like this because I want to thank the important organization, share key messages, look to the future. So let me run through some of those now. Starting at the top of my list, we have the Euroclima Plus program, the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, FIA Foundation, GIZ, the Institute for Transportation Development and Policy, the International Association of Public Transport. Moving on, the Rocky Mountain Institute, the Slow Cat Partnership, as in the whole team of people, the Sustainable Mobility for All Alliance, the Transport Decarbonisation Alliance, Transport Scotland, and the World Resources Institute. These are names familiar to many of us and the people working hard on this agenda around the globe. They're working in partnership with the Alliance of Small Island States and the Smart Freight Centre. I'd also like to thank the Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative, known to all of us as TUMI, and the Mobilise Your City Partnership for their support. Special thanks go to the NDC Transport Initiative in Asia, Netherlands Enterprise Agency, the Rocky Mountain Institute, and World Resources Institute, specifically for their financial contribution towards the digital platform that has allowed us to conduct this online format. And in a year of online formats, it's a pleasure to be coming to a close with such an important meeting and to have made such a diverse set of minds, brought such a diverse set of minds together. En route to COP26 was designed to be relevant and easily accessible to colleagues around the world. It has been lovely, although a bit exhausting, to follow all of these sessions across world time zones. And I know at different times I've had colleagues in New Zealand saying, I'm off to bed now, or Brazilians saying, I've just got up, or it's really early in the morning. So we thank everyone for the extra effort that they make to join in the conversation. We had more than 1,000 registered participants over the 3 days. It's a wonderful opportunity to engage with so many actors. Even if we can't meet in person, we can reach more people with these formats. It's been an honor to host around 150 speakers, an impressive lineup across different areas of expertise and stakeholder groups, from national government and local government, civil society, private sector, academia, philanthropy, and multilateral entities, and a phenomenal mix of nationalities, generations of professionals, and a great mobilization of women as well. It just reinforces the importance of the diversity and the team that we need to achieve our objectives. It's not my job without mentioning outreach through our social media channels, and the hashtag, and feel free to use it during this session, don't stop now, En route to COP26 has reached over 100,000 users on Twitter alone. And I know from LinkedIn, it's also incredibly active there. The conversation is rippling outwards from this digital moment here into all the corners and pockets of the globe. So don't forget, hashtag En route to COP26. It comes up very quickly if you enter it into your system. Let's keep it going for this last session. So, over these days, we've enjoyed 9 thematic sessions covering topics central to the acceleration of transport decarbonisation. Topics such as national climate and transport strategies, placing transport decarbonisation at the heart of green and equitable economic recovery, rethinking urban mobility and harnessing opportunities to fast track its delivery, ending internal combustion engines for passenger and freight transport, enabling sustainable maritime transport for small island developing states, and maximizing the links between transport and health. I've been reminded about the diversity of contexts and circumstances. I've mentioned already people waking up early in Brazil, but from Argentina to the Maldives via California and Mozambique, we are learning from each other. We can learn a lot more, and we can translate these global lessons into locally appropriate solutions. We had 2 sessions on freight. As an advocate for walking, freight is not particularly close to my heart, except its impact on our public spaces and our urban environments. But it's a critical part of this discussion, and it has been neglected. I was amazed actually to hear that in the preciousness of our space, 80% of vans in cities deliver just 1 or 2 consignments. Just filling vehicles better could heap huge benefits in reducing the carbon emissions of transport. And with this as an increasing on-demand delivery mode in our developed cities, we have to address this. And we heard, though, that it's not all about technology. This morning, in our Early Bird Gets the Worm session, we discussed how low-tech walking and cycling can offer many solutions for our shared challenges. And audience polls throughout the event have revealed that it's largely a challenge related to, no surprises here, but governance. Good, strong leadership, shared ambition, and sound prioritization. And I think we'll be hearing about some of that from our next speakers. We need to enable the regulatory and financial frameworks and do the capacity building to grow this community and enable more to find their pathway into transport decarbonisation is an easy step. So how do we bring all this together? Well, it won't surprise you. The team are developing an event outcome document honouring the richness of these session outcomes, and it will be available soon. In the meanwhile, I'm going to let them have a sleep first. I'd like to highlight some key messages that cut across 3 days and have recurred and coalesced in our discussions. Firstly, transport decarbonisation is essential to green, equitable recovery post-COVID-19. We've all lived through this unprecedented year. It's not going to transform magically on the 1st of January back to business as normal. We do have to think forwards from here and how we translate that into future actions. And we cannot, as they say, waste this crisis. As governments seek to enable economic recoveries, we can't let them default to the wrong measures. It must be with accessible, efficient, green, healthy, and resilient transport investments that create socio-economic opportunities and address social justice. Transport has a big part of our greenhouse gas emissions, contributing 1/5 of global energy-related GHGs. And under business as usual, this is projected to double by 2050. It's our duty to reach the 1.5-degree target called for in the Paris Agreement. But in an environment with fast-growing demand for mobility and freight, this is certainly a challenge. We cannot go backwards. We must go forwards and reduce these carbon emissions as part of the recovery decisions that are made, because they will stay with us for a very long time. Message number 2. This is the time for international, national, and subnational regulatory and investment frameworks to enable the transformative force of passenger and freight decarbonisation measures in full alignment with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. This is the urgency of decisions for post-pandemic recovery, not to derail us from achieving ambitious systemic decarbonisation, because they will define land transport, shipping, and aviation for the next decade. Message number 3, applying the hierarchy of avoid, shift, and improve. We've heard about it lots here and in other discussions. This hierarchy of strategies with integrated, intermodal and balanced approaches is central to unleashing the full benefits of transport decarbonisation in terms of a zero emission system and equitable access to mobility. With placemaking policies based around proximity and accessibility, we have to enable people to avoid unnecessary trips and access their work and service opportunities. We need to encourage those that can to shift to less carbon intensive modes, from private vehicles to public transport, to shared mobility, walking, cycling, water-based freight, electrified road rail freight, cargo bikes for that last mile. These are critical shifts that we need to make, and we need to sustain those who are already moving in these low carbon modes and reward them for those efforts. And finally, when these other measures have been taken, it is a hierarchy. Let's avoid first, shift second, and then improve vehicle design, energy efficiency, and clean energy sources for different freight and passenger vehicles. Maximize the opportunity in the era of electrification. Sadly, most of the effort is in improve at the moment, but we can balance out across this hierarchy to deliver that. And finally, we all have a role to play when we boldly engage our collective multi-stakeholder know-how, vision, and leadership. We multiply the positive impact of transport decarbonisation, its positive impacts for the people, for the planet, for our prosperity, and for our partnerships. There's an expression here that I really picked up. We need to engage in radical cooperation. We have to enable the multi-sectoral systems thinking to inform the way we deliver across the board, from global levels, national, local, and on everyday decisions. And we have to enable the generation of emerging and young leaders who are boldly reimagining business models, investment, political leadership, knowledge generation, and activism for transport decarbonisation. So that was our last 3 days. That's amazing. So what are the next 330 or so? It's now less than 11 months to COP26. One of our objectives for En route to COP26 was to nurture further transport decarbonisation momentum, set out clear collaborative pathways so that our community arrives at COP26 in full stride. We can't waste a moment. New and exciting processes and initiatives were announced over these last few days. A full list will be contained in the outcome document I've just discussed. And in these few moments, I would like to mention a couple of key ones. Ms. Gloria Hart, Minister for Transport and Telecommunications of Chile, representing COP25 presidency, announced a series of peer-to-peer exchanges in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to bring national transport and climate officials together to work on transport decarbonisation. Mrs. Stingy van Verhoeven, Minister for the Environment of the Netherlands, in her capacity as chairwoman of the Transport Decarbonisation Alliance, announced that the Alliance is launching a process towards a global memorandum of understanding to advance and accelerate the market for zero-emission medium and heavy-duty vehicles, to be signed at COP26 by the largest possible group of signatories. This global MOU will aim at aligning national governments' minimum targets. While we're in the Netherlands, the government of the Netherlands will host in 2021 a series of exchanges on transport decarbonisation investment, aiming to deliver specific recommendations for different parts of the transport transition to scale up and optimise investment in transport decarbonisation by COP26. In addition, a number of resources and reports have been recently launched or soon to be launched, including the UITP Climate Leadership Declaration to support the global public transport sector to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 in a cost-efficient manner. I'm sure it will have a snappier title than that. The Global Fuel Economy Initiative's Vehicle Efficiency and Electrification, a global status report, the flagship report by the NDC Transport Initiative for Asia, the National Urban Mobility Policies and Investment Programme guidelines by the Mobilise Your City Partnership, and close to my heart, the Slow Cats Transport and Climate Change Global Status Report, 2nd edition. The climate action pathways developed under the leadership of the high-level climate action champions by the coalitions and initiatives of the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action and the Champions team will be launched on the 11th of December to commemorate the 5th year anniversary of the Paris Agreement. These pathways will serve as the sectoral roadmaps for the decarbonisation. The Transport Climate Action Pathway, co-facilitated by SLOCAT and the International Transport Forum, and collectively developed with contributions by a wide range of stakeholders from our community, is among the pathways to be released next Friday. But these examples don't do justice to the panoply of announcements and initiatives launched or highlighted during these 3 days. I invite you to stay tuned for the outcome document for the full list. And so, friends, we have once more experienced firsthand that multi-stakeholder engagement and action are essential to developing and implementing transport decarbonisation for climate action and equitable access to mobility. However, in reality, we know that each group can still deliver further within their respective remits and in cooperation with each other. And it's the imperative of accelerating structural change before COP26 that the outcome document will provide no regret action recommendations for our different stakeholder groups. But it's not your only resource. Please use the En route to COP26 materials, the session recordings, tools and materials to support your work in the months ahead. These will be available shortly. And to take a minute to enjoy some videos of highlights which will be prepared by Tumi and the FIA Foundation. So to close my remarks, over the last 30 years, transport emissions have grown by 60%, now equivalent to the emissions of China. The challenge, 1,100 million tonnes of carbon per year. The challenge for the next 30 years is to dramatically reduce them. This is not going to be easy, but we're in a climate emergency, and addressing emissions is essential to stabilise the climate and achieve the Paris Agreement objectives. I remain optimistic. I'm an optimistic person, but it is based on realism. There is a lot of work ahead, but the level of unprecedented disruption we are living through this year is opening pathways for accelerating our transport decarbonation across road, maritime, and aviation in ways that in February was inconceivable. I would like to paraphrase Tuesday's opening statement by Minister Gloria Hutt. As the chair of the SLOCAT partnership and as a custodian of our shared planet Earth, I call on all of you, political leaders, business executives, entrepreneurs, experts, activists, concerned citizens, to do everything you can to deliver efficient, accessible, clean, and healthy mobility for everyone now. I'd now like to welcome our speakers for the next part of this session. I'm pleased to welcome Her Excellency Minister Moges, Minister of Transport for Ethiopia, and Ms. Heike Henn, Interim Director for Climate Policy, Energy, Urban Development and Environment, Commissioner for Climate Policy and Climate Financing, Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, Federal Republic of Germany, to the discussion. Welcome, Minister. Welcome, Commissioner. I would like to invite Minister Moges to share her remarks. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. As per the recommendation, I have 3 major suggestions to make. The first one is developing states should be encouraged and supported to have robust greenhouse gas data management system and its related capacity building. Over the next 12 months, I suggest developing countries to commence or pave ways to have a robust greenhouse data management system and dedicated institutions. Those who already have such institutions should have the capacity to bring real-time emission levels, trends, and analysis. In this regard, institutions available in developing states should be supported or encouraged to have skilled manpower and technical capacity to effectively run greenhouse gas management system. As the world has initiatives like road safety observatories that has been established with the intention of bringing accurate and compatible road safety data, I suggest the world to introduce same for emission or green mobility related observatories that intends to bring common outputs using common methodologies and approaches. My second recommendation is world states, especially developing states, should well be encouraged to incorporate low or non-carbon mobility at their strategies and at their top agenda. Developing countries, while setting their development agenda or plan preparation or strategy formulation, they should be encouraged to prioritize streets for people at first, then streets for mass transit systems like BRT and LRTs, and also electric mass transport and trucks. This by itself could pave the way for sustainable and low-carb transport mobility. Private sector should be encouraged to involve in the low or non-carbon mobility system and should well be encouraged to assemble or import eco-friendly electronic buses and trucks. So developing states should encourage this through amending their policies and legal frameworks, as governments may not be able to address the challenge of this 21st century just alone. The third one is international cooperation in relation to low or non-carbon transport mobility should take the momentum in the coming 12 months as we started it right now. Countries or cities has to exchange their best practices in relation to green mobility with other challenged cities or states. In this regard, key donors, partners, and other international organizations should continue to contribute their parts in making or creating a platform that we are just using now and to take it to the next best level in a continued manner uninterruptedly. As decarbonization asks trillions of dollars for its successful implementation, it would be further much difficult for developing countries to allocate scarce budget for decarbonization-related initiatives and targets. And as sustainable transport system benefits the entire humanity, it should be great that world countries should come and work together to avail alternative financial options, especially for developing countries. The world should consider selling second-hand vehicles, trucks, or automobiles to developing states, as it is lethal effective, as it has lethal effect directly or indirectly the entire humanity. As the world stands together for wildfire happening in Amazon forest, same first stand should be encouraged to avoid second-hand pollutant vehicles from the world. We all need to stand together to defend the rights and to protect our environment. The last one is countries should be encouraged or supported to evaluate their sustainable mobility performance in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals, policy frameworks, and other regional and continental goals and targets. If we are able to do this, as per my view, we can attain the target that we are setting in this COP26 that we expect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. I'm pleased to now invite Commissioner Henn to present her remarks. Commissioner, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, Minister Moges, Mrs. Brown-Thornton, panelists, participants. It's really a pleasure to be part of this discussion, and Your Excellency, Minister Moges, listening to your inspiring points on how to better cooperation in the next 12 months with your experience in Ethiopia is very inspiring. Your points are very relevant, and I will try to pick up on those while hoping that peace and national unity in Ethiopia prevail. So what needs to happen for sustainable mobility for everybody now at the end of 2020, while we are still in a profound crisis and have postponed the super year for all urgent climate sustainability and biodiversity related matters to 21. So from my perspective, 3 points are important. One, decarbonization of transport needs to be an integral part of recovery efforts. Second, we face the risk of system damage and need to focus on sustainability of our investments in transport. And third and lastly, we need high and increasing ambition for the decarbonization of transport as our North Star. So first aspect, decarbonization of transport contributes to socio-economic recovery and has to, because the links between the current health and economic and the climate crisis and the transport sector are overwhelming. Emissions, air pollution, jammed cities on the one hand, and access to jobs, economic opportunities, social services, markets, etc., through mobility on the other hand. And transport in itself is a large employment sector for about 210 million people around the world, especially in public transportation. And you mentioned also social inclusion and equity. Particularly vulnerable members of society, such as the poor and women, tend to rely heavily on public transport offers and active forms of mobility. And ensuring that these offers are available in cities means to create more equal access to everyone. And for example, we support an initiative, Women Mobilize Women, that aims at ensuring that transport planning incorporates the needs of women by including them in the planning process. Sustainability, climate friendliness is very important, but social inclusion as well. Therefore, investments in sustainable and inclusive transport, new technologies, new business models have huge co-benefits and need to be part of our efforts to recover better. Second point I would like to make, we need to avoid the risk of system damage. What do I mean by that? The transportation sector has been heavily affected by the pandemic. So let's strengthen our partners, stabilize existing and functioning structures. And to make this happen, we need to provide guidance and action to seize the opportunities to make the transport sector more climate friendly and sustainable. And this requires us to take decisive action and govern the effects of the pandemic on the sector more strongly. It won't happen automatically, although I'm also an optimist. But if we fail to act, we have seen that the effects of the pandemic could mean the sector becomes even more carbon intensive. Why could that be? Strain on budgets in cities, but also regional entities and national governments, increasing debt. So that might lead to stranded assets, collapse of initiatives and partners, and loss of the potential for innovation if we don't take care of this development. Transport patterns shift. For example, if people use less public transport and more motorized individual transport. We've seen this looking back in the SARS crisis in 2002 and 2003, even after the crisis. So what can help in this sense, and where are the opportunities for us? Digitalization, like today, or the last 3 days, working remotely, avoiding traffic. Traveling and shopping locally, shorter delivery chains. What else? Investing in better, safer, and more high-quality public transport that is more attractive and safer to a broader audience. And finally, active mobility. You can see in my background the River Rhine, and I'm happy to be able to cycle every day to my work. And many cities during the crisis, from Bogota to Berlin, have created this kind of spaces, but this needs to turn into permanent changes. And Minister Moges, I know that in Ethiopia, you have a lot of experience also in fostering non-motorized transport and pushing and including this in your strategic vision. So to avoid the risk and to seize the opportunities, bold action is needed by national and local governments, but also, and I agree with you, Minister Moges, by multilateral development banks and international partners to increase know-how and capacity, like you mentioned, and access to funding for investment in sustainable mobility. My third and last aspect, we need high and increasing ambition for the decarbonization of transport as our North Star. And yes, already a lot has happened. the ambitions in the sector are already high, and the exchange during the last 3 days have shown the spirit and commitment in the sector. And 143 out of 160 countries include strong reference to transport in their NDCs. But we are still not on track. And we need even more ambitious and concrete and robust goals in the NDCs and the respective partnership plans to create sustainable transport systems after the pandemic. And with this ambition, we need to get the policies right and to change markets, cut fossil fuel subsidies, CO2 pricing, for example, because this will set the right incentives and signals to get the private sector that is needed and financing partners on board. And looking forward, we very much welcome that the incoming UK presidency has made transport a priority for the COP26, which will help us to step up the ambitions to build back better even more. And the trillions that will fuel the recovery efforts in the coming months and the years need to incorporate these ambitious investments for sustainable mobility, for our health, for our social inclusion, for jobs and economic growth towards a 1.5 degree world. So over to you again, and thank you very much for the attention.
Many thanks, Commissioner. Very inspiring remarks about the comprehensive package that we need to address the challenges that we face. Minister Moges, are you available to join us again on camera? We just have a few short minutes to talk through some of the priorities that we can imagine for the next 12 months. Perhaps I'll go to you first, Commissioner Henn, and ask if in the next minute you could share with us 1 to 2 minutes thinking forwards between now and COP26. We have a time to focus our efforts. What would be the 3 priorities for the sustainable low carbon transport movement to get us on the right track for this? You've mentioned lots of things already. I don't mean to take from what you've said, but thinking specifically about the next 12 months and in a couple of minutes, if you could share that with us, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I very much agree. The next 12 months are crucial because they will be the start of the next decade. And what we decide then will basically cement the pathway for the next decade. So we have to be careful. So 3 aspects. First, we need to activate the potential of existing solutions for low carbon and equitable transport in order to save time and be efficient and effective. So one good example also to overcome obstacles like the lack of capacity and knowledge and planning and project preparation is the Action Towards Climate Friendly Transport Initiative, ACT. You mentioned it in the beginning. So we want to get 100,000 e-buses ready to procurement by 2025. So we need these kind of concrete action to overcome obstacles and get the right signals to the market by activating then more potential of the market because the solutions are there. Second aspect, we need to get out of the silos and should actively seek the dialogue with other relevant sectors and actors beyond the transport community. We are all very important, but we need to reach out. And also looking at the COP26, not stick to the important 5 pillars of the presidency, but bring people together. We need the energy sector, we need the sustainable cities, and we need the private sector. And partnerships are central, like SlowCat. I mean, you are just the example with 90 members. World Bank Sustainable Mobility. So these kind of innovative partnerships that reach out and in uncomfortable spaces sometimes, this is important. And finally, and thirdly, to allow more implementation of sustainable infrastructure, we need financing. The minister laid it out as well. And the COVID pandemic made it difficult. There are instruments for cities to increase their revenues and get the right signals out for the market as well. For example, congestion prices, parking fees. These can be easy solutions with multiple benefits. We have other initiatives like the GAP Fund that facilitate financing. TUMI you mentioned as well. So there's a lot out there. So let's join forces and let's move.
Thank you. Fantastic remarks. And I'm particularly inspired by your last comment about financing, because it doesn't have to cost a lot. We could choose some low cost options. And it would be remiss of me as CEO of Walk 21 not to mention, as you did already as well, that Ethiopia now has a national strategy for non-motorized transport. And there's not many national strategies globally for walking and cycling. We are working hard in many places and they are emerging more and more, but they help that critical focus. And I congratulate the Minister for that. I wonder, Your Excellency, are you able to join us for some final remarks? Just wait 1 second to see if she can come back onto the camera and hear about some final priorities as we look forward to this. As you say, the next 12 months, as you say, these are the critical steps. And let's hope we don't build a concrete path that locks us in, but we build a permeable, sustainable drainage path that enables movement. We seem to have lost the Minister. I'm not sure if that's a tech issue, but I'm not getting some remarks from her. So I think it leaves me then to move to thank you, Commissioner Henn, very much. And thank you, Minister, for joining us and sharing with us not only your understanding of the issues, but your commitment and passion for them in helping this community, because I do believe we have a strong multi-stakeholder community and we are more and more reaching into those silos that you mentioned, Commissioner, and building those relationships that recognize that all of these partners come together to deliver the futures that we want. So thank you very much, Commissioner Henn, and thank you, Minister. And so now to close my time and this session with in the closing plenary that we have today, I want to share with you something that really touched me throughout these last few days. I'll be honest, I didn't attend every session, but I got to as many as I could. And I was particularly energized by the words of Kaya Axelson. She's one of our young transport decarbonisation leaders. And on Tuesday morning, or Tuesday, who remembers which time zone, she talked about what was once considered radical and activist, the things that would have been deemed way off the mark yesterday is now considered critical, imminent, and highly reasonable today. As we face this climate emergency, we must take that radical energy, take those no regrets actions and collaborate on this. And I really appreciated her perspective on that, because I think recognizing how fast the agenda can shift, how quickly we can move from a degree of global complacency to a degree of global emergency, but also to recognize that what once was radical is now reasonable. So the work of our sustainable transport community is as relevant as ever, and we keep evolving. And anyone who's listening today who doesn't already belong, please come and join us. Help us improve and continue to build the momentum and to deliver the high impact actions that we and our communities need. I invite you to stay with the debate for the rest of this session at home and internationally over the next 12 months. And don't forget, #EnRoute to COP26. We're going to move now to the next segment, which will be chaired by Mr. Jules Kortenhorst, who is the CEO of the Rocky Mountain Institute. And he is going to carry this question about what should be prioritized in the next 12 months and over the next decade. In this section, we've heard briefly some remarks already and some ideas. We've got to get out of silos. We've got to enhance financing. But I also particularly liked, we have to activate existing solutions. We have to release the potential of what we already know works. And I think this next session is going to be a very interesting and fascinating discussion from some real experts with on-the-ground experience in that. And so I'm pleased to be passing the floor to Mr. Kortenhorst to lead us into the next session.
Thank you very much, Madam Thornton. A pleasure to be here this morning, this afternoon with all of you around the world, with a very esteemed panel that will break out in two groups. First, a panel that will discuss acting better, incentives for an accelerated transition. And then a group that will talk about leading together, multi-stakeholder partnerships for impact. Because as Madam Thornton said earlier in her remarks, radical collaboration is going to have to be a crucial ingredient in making the progress that we need over the next 12 months and beyond. But let's start with the first panel, and I'm very pleased to introduce to you first, His Excellency Secretary Blumenfeld, the Secretary for Environmental Protection of the State of California, clearly the front runner of action here in the United States. Next, Edison Broce, who is a Member of Parliament of the National Assembly in Panama. A very warm welcome, Mr. Broce. And finally, my old friend and the CEO of the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, ITDP, Heather Thompson. We can't hardly do an applause online, but a virtual applause for our three panelists. Welcome. And let me start the conversation on what incentives are necessary for an accelerated transition and how we move faster by asking Secretary Blumenfeld, how is California tackling the transportation emissions in a way that provides for health and equity benefits for all Californians? Your context has changed over the last couple of months, but you've been leading from the front, even under the still current administration. Tell us about what you're doing.
Morning, Jules. Morning, everyone. Really appreciate being part of this panel. And yeah, this next 12 months is critical. And certainly we've been busy dealing with a lot of the impacts of climate change over the last 12 months. And as everyone else has mentioned, also dealing with COVID. Just to contextualize it, obviously Californians love their cars. And in California, the transportation sector is responsible for more than half of all the greenhouse gas emissions. It's also responsible for the majority of smog pollutants and toxic air contaminants. And that's particularly important in the context of the United States. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Clean Air Act, but there's still a huge amount of work that we need to do on that front. So these emissions cumulatively pose a direct threat to our environment, to the economy, and to public health. And without addressing transportation sector emissions head on, we won't be able to meet our climate targets, including our goal of getting to 2045 carbon neutrality. So transforming the way that we move people, goods, and accelerating the deployment of zero emission vehicles will take the biggest bite out of the state's carbon and air pollution. This will take a number of different focuses, as we heard just now from Commissioner Henn and the Minister from Ethiopia. It also includes a strong focus on active transportation, how we get people out of their cars into biking and walking. When we think about protecting public health, it's a very strong focus on equity, Jules, how we help disadvantaged communities of color that have experienced historic and persistent burdens, and are also the most vulnerable to air pollution and climate impacts. So we, no secret here, are experiencing the worsening impacts of climate change. We just had the hottest record August in actually the US history here in Death Valley. We had the state's largest wildfires, more than 4 million acres of our state burned, exacerbated by tens of millions of trees that are dead from years of drought. So as the governor likes to say, if you have any doubt about climate impacts, come to California and you'll see them firsthand. Our goal is to aggressively move further away from our reliance on climate changing fossil fuels. And our Governor Newsom, issued an executive order a few months ago requiring the sales of all new passenger vehicles be zero emissions by 2035, and that all operations, and this is important because it's not just about passenger vehicles, but all operation of medium and heavy duty vehicles be 100% zero emission by 2045. So as you mentioned, we have been taking national leading actions on zero emission vehicles, and they really have to focus on every single element of how we work through the state, especially about 41% of all the containers into the United States come through our state of California ports. And so we have to focus on ports, on rail yards, on highways, on distribution centers, and really, really focus on equity to make sure that we're designing our programs to clean up the most vulnerable communities first. And then finally, we have within this 2035 transportation goal of getting to zero emissions, short haul trucks and off-road equipment, and operations that directly improve air quality for tens of millions of people living in places that you may never have heard, but in California, they matter a lot, which is the San Joaquin Valley, where a lot of our food is grown, and the LA basin still are places that are breathing air 50 years after the Clean Air Act that is not clean enough. So our goal is to double down on those efforts, even during COVID. And later I can talk about kind of the intersection between rebuilding and how this transportation work can go forward. Thank you, Jules.
Thank you, Jared. Let me now turn to Edison Broce, Member of Parliament in Panama. And we heard Jared speak about the role of electric mobility in the priorities in California. And that sort of jives because that's the home of Tesla. That's often where people think, well, that's the part of the world where people can afford it. But electric mobility has also been a part of your priorities. And so may I ask you in your opening comments to comment on why is that one of the priorities for Panama? Why have you put electric mobility on the agenda of your work?
Thank you, Mr. Jules, and thank you for the invite. Greetings to all the panelists. It's a pleasure for me to be here on behalf of my country and show what Panama is doing. Panama is a small country in Central America, and it's got many challenges as every country in the world. Nonetheless, we believe this is an unprecedented time for important change. And that change can be towards tackling climate change, which is the greatest threat of our times. Panama has already complied to international agreements, such as the Paris Accords, where it's got to give its fair share. So out of the generations of greenhouse gas emissions in Panama, as we have a services-based economy, it does make so much sense to commit to make a transformation in transport, to make transportation more sustainable. I am pushing within the parliament the e-mobility bill, although I am conscious and I know for sure that this is just one component of a sustainable transportation, which is crucial to achieve goals and to cooperate within a global community, because climate change might not be tackled only for in great countries, in big countries. Everyone has the possibility to be a champion and to show the world that change is possible, but it takes time, it takes effort, and it takes building coalition and ecosystems. I think this has been one of the most crucial parts of what we have been doing in Panama, to make a coalition between, not only between politicians, but also within private sector, different stakeholders in the activists, and try to unify perspectives even within all those groups, because even though everyone wants to see transformation, it doesn't mean everyone has the same north or the same vision. So it is quite important to start these kinds of ecosystems, because this topic of making transportation more sustainable, it does have transformational potential, because it goes way beyond transportation. We're talking here about creating jobs. The region as a whole, Latin America, can create more than 5 million jobs in times where most people are seeing challenges on their stability on this COVID situation. But this is a difficult time, but also an opportunity to make unprecedented change, unprecedented disruption. And that will be made if we work together, if we cooperate, if we enhance multilateralism. And I believe, and I'm convinced, Panama has something to offer. Panama has some experience that we're already working, and we have been learning a lot, because one thing is to have an idea where you want to get, and the other is to get all the stakeholders on the table, sit the politicians, sit the private sector, sit people in the executive branch. When you have that, you realize there's even way more than electromobility touches. It is a great area, and I think at the end of the day, this is about people. This is definitely about people, and it does have a high impact on people's lives, because we are living in times where pollution is killing so many folks, especially in humble areas, poor air quality. And I believe this is about helping people have a better quality of life, and also tackling inequalities, because we need to prioritize people. And I think that can be changed and can be done if we definitely work together and certainly prioritize what needs to prioritize. And I would like to finalize mentioning that Panama, it's got tremendous potential on this subject. We are a country that does depend on oil, but we also generate lots of electricity and even export electricity. So we do have a competitive advantage on taking a wider look at this topic, electrifying transportation, and will definitely create way more opportunities than only importing electric cars. So I finalize with that, and back to you, Jules.
Thank you, thank you. Heather, let me turn to you. I know that your organization, ITDP, has been working around the world in cities where the health and breathable air considerations that both Edison and Jared highlighted are very central in the focus of local leaders. Tell us about the work that your organization is doing, and tell us about the priorities and the incentives for local administrations as they think about optimizing the transport sector for everyone in their cities. You're on mute, Heather. That famous sentence of 2020.
Thought the panel was going to do that. Thank you, Jules, so much, and great to be with you. It's been a while since we've seen each other, but been working on this agenda together for many years, and it's great to be with esteemed panelists. Yes, ITDP celebrated our 35th year anniversary this year, so we have a long history of working in cities, essentially trying to make them less oriented around cars. So many cities develop to make more room for cars and not enough room for people. So it's all about putting people first and making sure that there's enough room to walk and cycle safely. In most cities around the world, people are highly dependent on walking and cycling and public transportation. Very few people actually have the ability to afford a car. And I really wanted to make a point to start this morning about the fact that electrification is necessary. but not sufficient. And it's really fantastic to hear so much difference in the conversation this year compared to just 5 years ago. And the fact, I love the comments that were made earlier in the panel about going from complacency to urgency and from radical to reasonable. I think we are making so much headway these days, and electrification is front and center on the agenda of so many leaders around the world, which is really tremendous. But electrification is not sufficient. We need to absolutely reduce the number of vehicles on the road. ITDP has done a number of analysis over the last years to inform policy discussions at the COPs. And one of the most recent ones that we did was really looking at the potential of electrification and automation, which has been so front and center in the discussions. And what we found is electrification and automation are not enough. You absolutely need sharing. And when I say sharing, what I really mean is public transportation. We found that if you just focus on electrification and automation, we can only reduce our current climate emissions by about 63%. If we focus on electrification, automation, and sharing, really focusing on public transportation, we can reduce our emissions by about 85%. And this is what we need to get to a 2-degree scenario, which we know is the bare minimum now of what we need to get to. And really what we need is more like a 1.5-degree scenario if we want to avoid a dramatic climate change. So we really need that kind of focus. And this is all with the underpinning assumptions that we go very aggressive on walking and cycling. It's so great to hear so many cities in the reaction to COVID really doubling down on safe infrastructure and policy for walking and cycling. We've been working closely with Minister Moges in Addis Ababa to help her and her team in adopting the non-motorized transit strategy and rolling that out. And we're working in similar cities all around the world to do so, which is really tremendous. And we really need to move to about an average of about 25% of people traveling by walking and cycling. And this is a reasonable assumption. That's on average, where places like the United States, we know can't really get that far because they're so far from that now. So if we have an assumption of about 11% of travel compared to places like the Netherlands, which we know can go much more aggressive to about 25% of their travel by bike, we can get there. And that would allow us to save about 7% of reduction in climate emissions of 7% by 2030 and 11% by 2050. And I think quite often people don't understand the real magnitude of the benefit of cycling. So those are absolutely fundamental to what we need to do. Another thing that we absolutely need to do is to implement more measures to actually control cars. We can't let cars increase around the world as we're seeing now, especially in the reaction to COVID, as many people are fearful of public transportation and are moving more towards private vehicles. So it's exciting to see that cities are bringing back conversations that have been kind of put on hold with new forms of making driving in cars less attractive. The most popular measures are parking, taking away parking or charging for parking, and also implementing low and zero emission areas. We see more and more cities adopting those measures. And then also implementing congestion charging. All of these measures can be done in equitable ways. Early next year, ITDP will be releasing a study that really shows how not just big cities that charge for driving like Singapore has done, but other methods that are much more reasonable that can be done with low capacity, like controlling parking. So again, electrification necessary but not sufficient. This all needs to be on a backbone of making walking and cycling safe, and we need car control measures as well.
Thank you, Heather. And it is such a relevant point. We've all seen how streets have opened up over the last couple of months if people were not out and about, and some of the streets were back to people as opposed to boxes. And yet, as you said, Jared, Californians like their cars, and we are not going to convince all Californians to jump on the bike permanently and definitively for everything in the near future. So electrification has been high on your agenda and on the agenda of Governor Newsom. And I was wondering if you would be willing to share with us some of your perspectives and maybe even some of your conversations with the automotive companies, because setting that goal of 2035 was a bold move, a very bold move. And then when you peel back the onion, you see it's not just for passenger vehicles, but it is for the whole spectrum of cars. What was the thinking behind this that gave you and the governor the confidence to take this bold measure?
Thanks, Jules. And just building on what Heather said, we're also looking at things like electric bicycles, because in places like San Francisco, it's hard to get up the hill. So there's a nice combination of electrification and active transportation. You know, Jules, I think we brought together leaders from across the state, 110 of them, to look at how we refashion our economy after COVID, how we rebuild better. And actually, nearly at the top of the list was the electrification of the transportation sector and equity. I think that intersectionality between making sure that as we rebuild using both equity and innovation, and really look at where those jobs are. So as Minister Broce said in Panama, really the economic benefits and how we look at doing that from a recovery perspective were really actually key to how we thought about what we're doing. And certainly since then, you've seen the UK, your state of Colorado, New Jersey, others want to follow. So most importantly in this transition time for us is sending clear market signals about where investment needs to happen. That happened 10 years ago with the movement away from coal-fired power plants towards renewables, and we really want to make sure we have that same transition and move quickly away. Our 2035 goal was really based on the fact that we want to get to carbon neutrality by 2045, then the last combustion car really has to be sold in 2035 or before that, in order to look at the life cycle of how long those vehicles are on the road. So just to give you a sense of the opportunity, Jules, you mentioned Tesla, but California is actually home to 66 different models of electric vehicles that are available today. We have more than 34 manufacturers in the state of electric vehicles. It's actually our #1 export. And so as we're thinking about that transition, we now have about 250,000 people working in the EV sector, which is 5 times more than work in the fossil fuel sector. So when we're talking to labor organizations, when we're talking to local communities, jobs is #1 right now as we kind of build out of the economic impacts of COVID. But right behind it are climate and equity. And so bringing all 3 of those together has really been probably the most important thing that we would recommend people think about not going back. We don't want to go back to a place where environmental justice is so endemic in a state like California. We don't want to go back to a place where vehicles are polluting. So as we think about building, we actually want to build forward, not build back. And the second thing we did after electrification of transportation was an equity statement on equity and climate about how our whole recovery has to be viewed through that lens. So I would say those are probably the most important elements. When we talk to vehicle manufacturers, you may have just heard from GM, and others are suddenly saying, oh, we're no longer going to be suing the state of California. We're going to be working to join them. Others like Ford and Honda and VW have been there from the beginning. So we really do need corporate leadership, is the point. We cannot have these folks be on the sidelines. They can't come out with big billboards and say, yay, we're green, but then not do anything to follow up. So we would encourage folks like Toyota and Chrysler, Fiat, and others to join. And they do a great job of telling us how environmentally friendly they are. What we need is those big companies to put their money where their mouth is and really invest in this transition.
Thank you. Yes, you emphasize rightfully the job opportunities associated with this transition and the number of jobs already in California around electric mobility. You highlighted that as well in your comments, Edison, and it begs the question, are all electric cars going to be manufactured in the United States and Europe, or are we going to see a rollout of the manufacturing footprint of these vehicles also to emerging economies around the world? Have you already had conversations with the private sector? Are the automotive companies looking at what they can do in your country, and how do we bring them into the debate? And as you talk about that, maybe highlight also not just passenger vehicles, but potentially electric buses as an important part of your transportation infrastructure.
Yes, I certainly agree with what Heather mentioned about how this is a comprehensive, there has to be a comprehensive approach beyond electrification of transportation, beyond private cars. I do believe that is quite important. And in order to achieve that, I find highly crucial to change people's mindset. In Panama, just like in California, people, especially young folks, when they graduate, they want to opt to have a new car, and that's what they want, because it's kind of a mindset thing that needs to be addressed at some point. So I believe it is important to try to boost a behavioral change by an agenda setting, a strategy, multi-stakeholder engagement, and that can definitely have an effect on public policy. And I can point out my own example. I run on a mostly environmental platform, which was quite unusual, not only in Panama but also in the region. And it has been a work that it's not being overnight, but some people have been identified and getting to understand this. And I think the key is to provide education, not only for citizens, but also politicians, because they can influence each other. And we can have citizens asking their politicians to care about this. But in order to get that, we need to explain the public how this will have a positive effect on them and how this will create opportunity. And certainly, as you mentioned, there is opportunity for emerging markets like Panama, for instance, to become an innovation hub or a manufacturer of electric vehicles. And that can be reached. Nonetheless, I think it is important to prioritize what Jared said about sending the right messages, sending the right signals. And that can be done through legislation, because you bring legal security to new investments, especially in these times of finding the right post-COVID recovery plan, where resources can be reallocated, where investments can be reallocated into something that actually makes sense. Even if people don't believe climate change is human-made, it does make sense to invest in electrification of transport and enhancing public transportation, because it makes transport more efficient, it makes it more sustainable, and in the end, it does make sense. So it is a common sense solution, and that it is important to explain both the public and politicians to know the consequences and the effective and positive externalities of working on these kinds of policies. But it has to be done progressively. It is important to get everyone to find a shared and a common understanding and vision, to have a state vision on where do you want to go, how far you want to go, how deep you want to go. And something I can highlight from the Panama process, most stakeholders, they know they want to push e-mobility, but it doesn't mean they all know exactly where this discussion will take us. That is why I insist building an ecosystem can give you multiple answers. Now we're finding to know that if we want to enhance this and to boost e-mobility, we need to update new legislation, existing legislation, to do new regulations that can allow also people and incentivize the market to go towards a more sustainable transport. But certainly, I believe education is important. I believe there is also opportunity, but this has to be very, very hand in hand. Education and so people know there is opportunity for boosting a new market for Panama and definitely for the world against this fight against climate change. Back to you, Jules.
Thank you. Heather, I'd like to pick up the conversation on electrification versus vehicles miles traveled in the context of a country where your and my organizations are both active, namely India. And like in Panama, but even more so maybe than Los Angeles, cities in India are congested. Traffic is amazingly complicated. And yet it is the dream of many an Indian to have their own form of transportation, which is why the Indian government has emphasized electric mobility and has recently come out with some important measures on stimulating that sector. But at the same time, you're such a passionate advocate for all those other things we need to do that actually reduce number of cars on the road. Talk to us about how you are reconciling those two things, and in the dialogue with Indian government, both at the federal and at the city level, how is that coming together?
Sure, and I can talk about India, but maybe also reference other places. You know, I think the comments earlier just show that we absolutely need a big cultural shift. But this really happens when you have the right regulations in place. I think one of the best forms of education is advertisement, and the advertisements from car companies that are actually promoting electric vehicles instead of fossil fuel based vehicles. And that really happens when you have the right regulations in place and the right subsidies in place. I actually am from Los Angeles. I'm sitting here in California now. And when I come back home, it really is a case in point to see how many electric vehicles there are on the roads here compared to anywhere else in the world, except for maybe China at this point. And it's because the state of California has been promoting clean, efficient vehicles for decades, and most recently with the electric vehicles. Also, we see that China is by far has the most number of electric vehicles on the road as well, also because they have had very successful subsidy and finance programs over the last 5 years or so. They were actually possibly going to reduce, China was going to reduce those subsidy programs this year, and they realized that they really hadn't gotten as far as they wanted in the penetration of electrification. And so they've decided to maintain those subsidies, which is, again, a great example. And I think now India, another huge country with such a huge population, is following suit. They just passed a policy, which I think you referenced, with $2.6 billion in subsidies for domestic manufacturing for batteries for 2- and 3-wheelers, as well as buses. And we know that in India, most people get around on 2- and 3-wheelers, tuk-tuks and such. And that's the same that we see all over the world. And more countries are interested in trying to fuel their domestic manufacturing. Even countries and cities like Kigali in Rwanda are now adopting different types of measures to bring in, I think it's Volkswagen is the most recent, but other manufacturers with an eye towards getting ahead on electric manufacturing. And I think the primary reason for that really is driving the economy, having more jobs. So if we can focus on the right jobs in the right places and really have a race to the top on electrification and batteries, that's the greatest thing we can do. I think it's also important to remember, though, that some countries, some cities are not going to be able to go fast enough, and that instead of just focusing again on electrification, we need to make sure these places have the cleanest vehicles possible. Often when richer countries adopt better vehicles, the hand-me-downs go to other markets, other cities. And these are often the most dirty vehicles that often are not even considered legal to drive on roads in California and Europe. They're belching soot. They often are missing parts. So we cannot let that happen. We cannot just export all of the dirty vehicles to these places. We need to make sure, again, that there's more and more buses in all of the cities around the world, and that these buses are the cleanest buses possible if they're not electric. More cities are adopting electric buses, but often they don't have enough money to have enough charging infrastructure, and charging infrastructure is an absolutely necessary part of the equation. So we need to make sure there's enough support and financing for both the charging and the vehicles. But again, if we can't get that far, we know how urgent our agenda is. If we can't get to electrification, we at least need to make sure that they've got the cleanest vehicles on the road.
Thank you, Heather. It poses an interesting question for California and for the US more generally, right? We are suffering from a horrible economic crisis as a result of the pandemic. And hopefully under the incoming administration, there will be room for green stimulus in the beginning of the new year. Where in your mind, Jared, should the priority lie? That electric charging infrastructure that is crucial to speed up the electrification, or public transportation infrastructure? And the harsh reality is we can only spend our dollars once. So how are you thinking about that trade-off, particularly back to your point early on, which is the important climate justice angle to all of this, right? How do we get people in the Central Valley access to clean transportation in the way that they can get to their jobs and to their schools and back home?
Yeah, so Jules, it has to be both. It can't be an either or. You know, we deal with a very fast urbanizing planet. More than half of the world's population lives in cities, but that means still a very large number of people live in rural areas. And so making sure, one, that as we help people go back into public transportation, to Heather's point, we really need messaging. People need to understand that it's safe, that it's clean, that it's fast. You know, when you see public polling in the United States, people are very reticent to get back on the New York subway. They're very worried about going back into public transit. So those systems are hemorrhaging money because of the loss of ridership. And we need to really make sure when we think about stimulus with the new administration that we're doing a number of things. One, helping them change the fleet with those fixed route electric vehicles. You know, there's a lot of things that can be done without batteries to help bring electric transportation. Certainly places like San Francisco still have it from the end of the last century. So thinking about how to help those systems is going to take money and time and patience, and we can't simply just abandon our public transportation infrastructure around the world because of COVID. And then secondly, in rural parts of the world, there's not good connectivity to public transit, but there are a lot of opportunities to think about, and there's another point Heather made about ride sharing. So how we're working with communities like places like Fresno and Bakersfield to help low-income communities have access to electric vehicles through shared networks. So significantly less expensive than putting in a whole public transit system. And until ridership comes to a point where it's economically feasible, that's what we need to do. And then I guess the final point is, when you think about how this all ties together, in California, our goal is, I think that the economic story is we've detached economic growth from carbon. So as we brought our carbon down, our economy has continued to grow. They've been detached. But when it comes to the electrons, our goal is to get to 100% carbon-free energy by 2045. So we do need to make sure, because there's this critique often about, well, if the energy isn't clean enough, then does it really make any sense to have electric vehicles? So we do need, as we're moving towards electrification, to also set the twin goals of moving towards 100% renewable energy, and at the same time make sure that our charging infrastructure, Jules, there was a lot of critique from the VW settlement with the VW cheating scandal, that those chargers went into places that were not accessible for low income or the public in general. So we need a strategy of deploying electric vehicle chargers that is also equitable and meets the vehicle where they're at. If you have to drive 50 miles out of your way to find a charger, you're really not going to change to an electric vehicle. So in conclusion, I think we need to do all of those at the same time and quickly.
One follow-up question that may be difficult to answer. So you have already a very broad investment agenda in front of you, and then there is still high-speed rail. Do you want to comment on that, or would you rather pass?
No, we're dedicated to high-speed rail. We are far behind, obviously, Japan, China, most of Europe. The US has been a laggard when it comes to those transportation options. But when you look at the climate benefits of getting people out of planes, which we haven't talked about, especially if you wanted to go between Heather and myself, which is like 400 miles, people get on a plane or they drive down highways. Getting people onto, for that route, a train is a huge, huge economic engine for the stations in between. It's a huge way of reducing air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. So yeah, trains are part of our future. We continue to struggle. Hopefully with a new administration in Washington, that train gets built a lot quicker.
Here, here. Edison, the same difficult question for you. A limited amount of financial resources and a difficult trade-off between how you allocate it. How does it look from the perspective of Panama City and Panama as a country, allocation between the EV infrastructure that is obviously crucial to your ambition there versus public transport?
Absolutely. When it comes to resources, that's one of the greatest challenges. And that's why I insist it is important to educate the decision makers, the politicians, the executive and legislative, because that will make them understand and realize that it is cost effective to reallocate resources into a more sustainable transportation. If we make these transformations, this will translate into a better life, into spending less in healthcare, into a better quality of life. And that is the heart of what a government should do, to focus on the people, to ask the people to understand their needs and to legislate on behalf of them. I want to highlight something that Jared mentioned about how they were doing consultations on different areas in California. I believe that is crucial. I believe it is important to get the community knowledge, to get them involved, and to explain to them as well how this new transformation can impact positively their lives. And again, I think although I am pushing e-mobility, I am convinced it is just a component of a broader approach to what a sustainable transformation of transport should be. And in order to accelerate this sustainable transformation, I believe youth can take also an important role on this, to engage youth. When we talk about environmental policies, including transportation here in Panama, the older generations, they're understanding, they're trying to understand, but the ones who, to our surprise, are way more committed are young folks. So I do believe intergenerational dialogues and putting people at the heart of these discussions can help us accelerate change. And at the end of the day, the decisions we're making now will definitely impact the lives of the younger generations, of our children or grandchildren. And so we better take the right ones. So I do agree it is a challenge when it comes to resources, but change cannot come overnight. One goes little by little, and that's why we've focused on e-mobility, although we believe with explanation, with understanding, with a shared vision and the state vision on mobility, we can certainly get other politicians and other actors and stakeholders to focus on the different other components, and that can definitely translate into accelerating the pace of a sustainable mobility. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Edison. And I must admit, your mention of intergenerational dialogue triggers me, because I am certainly of the generation where my biggest joy after finishing school was to get my first car. And I have 4 children who are about in that stage of life right now. And not a single one is the owner of a car. Public transport, Heather, it will please you to know, and public transport is how they go around. I want to pick up on one comment in the chat function from Dong Tran, one of the participants from Vietnam, highlighting the importance of EV rollout versus renewables rollout. And Jared, you already pointed to the importance of that argument, also sometimes used by those who are resisting the transition. At our institute, Rocky Mountain Institute, we do a lot of work in electricity as well. And it is crystal clear that the speed at which the power sector is shifting in most countries around the world, also in developing countries and emerging economies, is mind-boggling. Pretty much everywhere around the world, the lowest cost of power generation is now wind and solar. And in fact, in many places, it now pays to shut down existing coal plants and replace them with new wind and solar. And that will help very quickly, Dong, with that transition to renewable electricity that will allow us to fuel the electric mobility transformation as well. We need to move to wrap up comments for this part of the panel. So can I ask each of you, if there is one thing that you need from another stakeholder in this debate, what comes to mind? And I'm going to start with you, Jared. You already mentioned the conversations with the automotive manufacturers, but you also could make questions to the federal government in DC. What is the number one thing that California needs in order to move this debate forward to accelerate the transition?
I think the number one thing that we need is to get price parity and range extension. So those issues of, that you talked about, the reason that we have this incredible revolution of renewable energy is because of the installed cost of a kilowatt of solar or wind has gone down 80% in the last 20 years. We need to see that with electric vehicles. The sooner that happens, the sooner you get 400-mile range batteries and vehicles that are less expensive, you will see the explosion of this market. So that's the number one thing that we need to see. And in order to do that, I think we're not at the stage of needing existing vehicle manufacturers to switch to electric. If they don't, I think they'll be left behind. I think this is a movement that's much bigger than any one manufacturer.
Absolutely. Well, Jared, I can tell you that all the work that my team has been doing on batteries and electric vehicle cost over the last 2 years indicates that crossover point where the EV becomes cheaper than the internal combustion engine car upfront is somewhere in the next 2, 3, 4 years. So I'm an optimist. Edison, what is the one thing that you would like help on that your work in Panama needs to move the ball forward?
It is definitely understanding the cause and the impact of changing mobility and all the opportunity that it brings with it innovation opportunities, circular economy opportunities to boost renewable energy. We're a country where 48% of our energy comes from hydro sources. Meanwhile, 51% comes from power plants. So I believe there is also opportunity to go further, to start with this discussion and then update legislation that enables us to have a better quality of life and a more sustainable country, and cooperate with our fair share on this global challenge, which is climate change. So definitely understanding and education can certainly help policymakers, politicians, and all stakeholders included to arrive to a common vision, to understand the cost of inaction. This is about time, and it does make sense economically. So I think education can help us arrive there.
Great, thank you very much. And Heather, to you the same question, of course. What does ITDP need? What does the work of a civil society organization pushing this transition need to move faster?
I would say that the top thing we need is more investment from the national governments into sustainable transportation, public transportation, walking and cycling in cities. Cities often really need the support of the national government to make this happen. Again, number one, I think I've said it many times, is more buses. Buses are the most cost-effective means of public transportation. It's great to have light rail and rail in countries that can afford it, but buses are the most cost-effective form of public transportation. So we need more and more buses and make them the cleanest and the greenest possible. And again, we need safe infrastructure for walking and cycling, and to have that be connected to public transportation with good urban planning and good urban infrastructure. But again, we absolutely require the support of the national government. And even when revenue is stressed, again, things like congestion charging can be a great source of revenue, but again, those often need the support of the national government to get them passed. A great example of that is in New York City now, where they've been sitting on the idea of congestion charging for a while, but we need the national government to support that. And with that, we have a lot of financing available through a bond measure that can support all sorts of investment in public transportation and walking and cycling infrastructure.
Great. Thank you, Heather, for those wise last words. And thank you, panelists, for your contribution to this first session. We are now magically flipping people from one set of seats to the next set of seats. So we say a thank you to Jared Blumenfeld from California, Edison Broce from Panama, and Heather Thompson from ITDP. And we welcome to this virtual stage the next three panelists. And I'd like all of you to welcome with me Mr. Seble Samuel, the co-founder and organizer of Ethiopia Open Streets Movement, Pascal Goumault, who is the head of international institutional partnerships of Moving On, and Projjal Dutta, the director for sustainable initiatives at the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York. So the benefit of a online panel is that this switch has hopefully successfully happened, and that I can start with my first question for you, Projjal. You lead one of the largest public transport, the sustainability efforts of one of the largest transport agencies in the world in New York. And that agency has obviously been hit hard over the last 9 months by the impacts of the pandemic. My question to you is, there is a new era looming. President Biden will be a reality on the 20th of January here in the United States. While we have talked a lot about what needs to happen in terms of new investment, the Secretary Blumenfeld already highlighted that we need to continue to invest in the existing public transport infrastructure. what is on your mind as you move into 2021 to help drive this change?
Thank you, Jules. I see that I'm unable to start my video. I think my earlier antics may have disabled me. The IT folks may have said, you don't need to look at this guy. But thank you so much.
We can hear you loud and clear, and maybe you can answer this question and then quickly break out to try to fix that while we turn to the other panelists. So please go ahead.
I do have a radio face, so that's good. Yes, no, so this is very crucial, and I heard Mr. Blumenfeld talk about it. I heard Ms. Thompson talk about it, and even earlier in the panels. I'll go into more detail perhaps when you come back to me, but I would like to say that transportation just does not seem to measure or get as high on the US agenda, the climate change and the sustainability agenda, which seems more occupied with the supply side. So the sustainability picture is a solar panel or a wind turbine, which is fantastic. But that picture says that we will solve this problem on the supply side. You don't have to do anything about the demand side. And really, it's the demand side, as Mr. Blumenfeld said, 50% of the emissions are coming from transportation. So I think there has to be a basic rejigging there. And also in terms of an intersection of equity and electrification, public transportation is bang in the middle of that Venn diagram. So that's another reason why we should be in the middle of that conversation. And finally, this provides a historic opportunity for creating jobs, just as jobs are being created in renewable energy generation, distributed storage, etc. There should be jobs, and these would be good local jobs, that we can utilize to repair and build out a public transportation infrastructure that the US used to have, but has neglected since the Interstate Highways Act in the mid-50s. So I'll stop right there.
Thank you. And one follow-up question before we jump to the next panelists. Do you believe that, there you are, it worked, that confidence in the safety of public transport will return and can be further boosted after this pandemic? Because of course it has been on the minds of everyone, even of myself, that using public transport in this difficult situation we're in worldwide right now has inhibited some of the progress of public transport organizations.
That's a great question, and that's a very visceral one for us at the MTA. For me personally, I have been a part of a volunteer, we are called the Mask Force. So we actually stand in stations and we go from a car to subway car, handing out free masks in case someone is not wearing one. And I will report with a great deal of delight that you can often go through all 10 cars or 8 cars of a train and not encounter a single passenger who is not wearing a mask. Similarly, in the platforms, everyone, New Yorkers who are famous for not following rules, for crossing the street in the middle of the block rather than on the crosswalk, these same New Yorkers have all been wearing masks, have been very respectful of distancing as much as they can. And I don't know if you came across that study by Sam Schwartz, but there are others as well. The literature is quite overwhelmingly in the opposite direction. Yes, understandably and intuitively, it seems that if you're in a public transportation vehicle, you are more likely to contract the virus from someone, but actually the data do not support that. Public transportation, perhaps because of this incredibly careful and measured leadership of our Governor Cuomo, but also the MTA's leadership in mandating masks and handing out masks and going at it from both the push and the pull. We have not had, in fact, it is places with much higher road usage, much higher car usage that are now in the midst of the worst breakout. And our ridership numbers are coming up. There's a New York Times article this morning about how it's at about 30%, 35%. And this is for, by the way, I will point out, this is for average for the day. If you look at the PM peak or the AM peak, the ridership is even higher. And if you account for the fact that now, unlike before, we are shut down 5 to 6 hours overnight, the ridership is actually even higher than what that average is reporting. So the riders want to come back. They are coming back. We are taking every precaution, and hopefully just being able to get this message out will convince people. I've been taking the subway all the time, and I have an 86-year-old mother at home, so I don't take this lightly.
Yeah, thank you. That is wonderful and encouraging news. And let me switch to you, Seble. And do I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah, it's Seble.
Seble. Wonderful. Seble, we heard from your minister earlier today. I have never been to Addis Ababa myself, but I have colleagues of mine who work there. I hear it is a sometimes somewhat confusing urban landscape where finding your way across the streets in between all the cars is not easy. Your organization is very much focused on that creating space for people walking and biking. Tell us about your work. Tell us about how you see the infrastructure needs in your capital city and across Ethiopia for people who don't have a car, and how does active transportation fit into the transportation picture in Ethiopia?
Definitely. Thank you very much. So yeah, for all those who haven't been to Ethiopia, the urban modal shares really favor active mobility. And in the capital city, it's more than 50% of the population that relies on active transportation. But in secondary cities, this can go up to even 90% of the population. But this is not necessarily reflected on the streets, because the street design, there's a lot of inadequate pedestrian infrastructure. There's hardly any protected cycling lanes. So there's been a following sort of a car-centric model of planning the city for a car-centric minority. And so there's a lot of really profound implications that come from that are often dangerous, with road safety and a lot of traffic fatalities and the street allocation, air quality levels, and the negative impacts on public health. So the movement that I co-founded is called Mangad Leso, and it means streets for people in Amharic. And it's really important because it gives people a glimpse or an experience of what streets for people can become when you center the majority of how people are moving onto the streets instead of shunning them to the fringes. And so you take out the motor vehicles of this equation. So every month, pre-pandemic, every month, we would block up about 15 kilometers of streets in 7 different locations of Addis for people to walk, to run, to play, to skate. And this started growing to other Ethiopian cities, and the principles around it around sustainable mobility and safe streets and social connection. And I think there's been a lot of different pieces that have made that possible. There's really strong city partnerships. And I think this political backing and leadership is vital, because there's a whole coalition behind it. And so, for example, the government has the ability to block off mass amounts of streets in the city in a way that solely civil society or solely research institutes or NGOs would never be able to. They can deploy traffic officers at all locations and volunteers, have a traffic management plan. All of these things are really vital. And the Ministry of Transport has also helped with the scaling. Every time it goes beyond just the capital city, there's the full support of the Ministry of Transport. And there's a really diverse collective of organizers that are part of this. I mentioned there's a lot of different city offices, but it's not only the transport city offices. There's the Youth and Sports Bureau, there's the Health Bureau. They give free public health testing at the locations. There's international institutions, ITDP is there. There's different research institutes. So I think all of these perspectives are really vital, because everyone is kind of boosting their strengths to have this Streets for People possible. But something that I want to stress is that it's not meant to solely be monthly programming or weekly programming. We want to reshape the streets. we want these to kind of change how we design and move it on our streets and reflect, in Ethiopia's case, how the majority of the people move, and have that be a safe and enjoyable experience to get from where you are to where you need to go, walking or cycling or taking public transport, as in Addis Abeba's case, 85% of the city does. So I think it's really good that now Mangad Lesa was embedded in a lot of the local and national policies on non-motorized transport as a key outreach and engagement and community building strategy to create around 1,000 kilometers of pedestrian infrastructure and 500 kilometers of cycling infrastructure within the coming decade. So I'll leave that there as a first taste.
But that already points to an important question, right? We sometimes think too lightly that active transportation doesn't require capital infrastructure. But you're actually pointing out it's not just about behavior and jumping on your bike or walking somewhere, but it's also about the government providing for the physical infrastructure to enable that. And that then again gets into budgets and money. Is that a big fight for your organization? Is that a big consideration for the government, or is there actually funding available for that infrastructure?
Yeah, I think that's been really great, is that there is not a separation really, because part of the organizing collective of Mangad Lesa, there are city offices, and every time it does scale, the Ministry of Transport is backing it. And now it's embedded in the capital city policy, in the national NMT policy, in the city's resilience strategy. And so there's these targets now to build really extensive networks for cycling infrastructure and for pedestrian infrastructure, because the modal share exists and people will continue to move that way, but it needs to be done in a way that's safe, that people can ensure they'll stay alive while they do that, because there are not always other economic options. So I think the fact that the upcoming NMT policies are really prioritizing the proliferation of that infrastructure is going to be vital to ensure that people who are already moving this way can do so in a way that's safe.
Thank you. I can't resist but making you a compliment for the amazing progress that you seem to have already been making in Ethiopia, and how can we replicate that across Africa, right? Pascal, time to come to you. So much of what we need to do in this transportation revolution towards sustainable transportation is about partnerships and working together. What, in your mind, is the role of the ecosystem approach between global organizations, private companies, public transportation companies, public authorities? How are we going to get that done? And tell us a little bit about the organization that you're leading in this arena.
Yes, thank you, Jules, for letting me share today. I'm very happy to share with you. Well, you know, I'm personally passionate about collaboration between people, collaboration between organizations. And my own organization, I'm part of Movin, is working hardly on that, because we strongly believe that decarbonization of transport is a global challenge that demands collective action. So we think that the business community can be a partner of choice for governments and policymakers. It's everything about collaboration between business and government and policymakers. And why? Just because private companies, they have the expertise in terms of innovation, they also have the skills, they have the experience, they have the investment resources and the tools. And really, if you consider the last 10 to 15 years, they have made huge progress. I mean, private companies have made huge progress. They have made more sustainable products, they have developed new services, and they're working hardly on new business models. They will go ahead with the support of governments and policymakers, and especially in the transport sector. The government and policymakers, they have a decisive role to play. I'm convinced on that, and without the support, no transformation can reach a critical scale. So everything is about collaboration. We must all work together, and we are pretty convinced as Moving On that everything relies on ecosystemic approach. Moving On, for instance, was created by Michelin and is today a global ecosystem dedicated to sustainable mobility. We work with governments, cities, civil companies, and NGOs to design solutions to make more accessible, safer, greener, and more efficient solutions. So today, what we do is, first, we have a summit once a year where people can meet, share their opinions, and so this is extremely important. But we also have long-term actions, and usually we say that we are not only a think tank, we're a do tank, because if there is not a single day in this year where we don't have people working together from the private sector and from the civil society to address difficult issues. For instance, one typical example for me is that Movin is involved with UITP and SLOCAT in Component 4 of ACT, with the objective of setting up a global dialogue arena with between private sector and the civil society. So this is one of the examples, and personally, I've seen for the last years a tremendous movement from the companies to find ways to work together as companies, but to work also with the civil society, and we want to address that. And if today, if there was an emblematic objective to show that there is a convergence of interest and actions between the private sector and the civil society, would be maybe some kind of a dream. It would be to have all the actors involved in the decarbonization of transportation to share discussions in the blue zone at the COP. This would be a strong signal that all efforts are converging between state and non-state actors. So, in a word, it's everybody in the blue zone for COP26.
That is a wonderful expression, Pascal, of something that in our organization has found recognition in the fact that our international climate negotiations increasingly have to move from the stage where we are negotiating about what needs to be done to actually planning what is happening, to making things happen. And one way of saying it is that everybody should be getting into the blue zone, but you could even imagine an alternative way of thinking about it is inviting the negotiators to come into the area for the side events and making them part of the real economy where we are now going to be implementing the vision that was laid out in the Paris Agreement. I think it's a very nice analogy. I want to go back to you, Projjal, because yes, public transport is a crucial ingredient of this transition in many cities around the world. It may not always take the form of the underground or subway system as it is in New York, but the MTA is a lot more than only the subway. And I saw in the chat that you have actually been to Addis Ababa. So from your perspective of one of the largest cities in one of the richest countries in the world, talking to Seble and to people in similar roles in developing and emerging economies, what are the opportunities that you see as you structure public transport in New York versus what can be done in developing countries and emerging economies, where not always the urban design is as far along as it should be for sustainable transport?
So in one word, Jules, I would say time. We didn't get from, so there was a time apparently that you could go from New York to Philadelphia or on the other direction, Cleveland or Cincinnati, by just riding the Inters, as they were called, commuter rail and subways. It was so well connected and public transportation was so omniscient and all present. And then very active disinvestment, the Interstate Highway Act I mentioned, and moves like that basically had these things wither on the vine. I see the opposite from my hometown where I was born and where I lived until I came here was New Delhi. In 1995, they were starting to construct the metro, and they have just been at it. And there are many things that could be improved. But the metro has transformed Delhi, and I think it has taken these 25 years. And the city and the growth starts to coalesce around public transportation. And this is not only sort of a New Delhi story. When they built the LA metro, they said it was a subway that went from nowhere to nowhere. And you can actually Google that. And today, roughly that kind of time frame, a generation, 30 years later, you know what happens? Somewhere gets up and moves to nowhere. So development happens, densification happens. These corridors mean something. And I think the experience of the system is very different from a mature 110, 115-year-old system where much of the effort needs to bring it up to snuff, to keep it in a state of good repair, to make sure that there is not a fall off of ridership. Of course, an event like the pandemic doesn't help, but to generally maintain it and grow it incrementally. Whereas in a place like Addis, I think it's the opportunity is just enormous, and I'm very confident that there too development patterns will coalesce around the transportation. So public transportation, and I am not, the MTA operates roughly 6,000 buses, and we are the largest bus operator too. So I'm not saying that heavy rail is sort of one size fits all, and it is not. I will be the first to accept it. But putting 2 steel rails down on the ground, I think, is a kind of signal that that the state, that society is serious about public transportation in a way that I think nothing else is. And in fact, this again is borne out by history. When the Interstate Highway Act happened, places that had managed to put a subway, basically a grade separated or elevated like Chicago, but basically grade separation into place, went through some dark days in the 70s and 80s with falling ridership, rising crime, poor maintenance, deferred maintenance, but by and large survived and thrived into the 21st century in the US public transportation systems. Whereas those that were not able to do grade separation had streetcars, they basically moving at the same speed. Public transportation's old name and its real benefit is rapid transportation, that there can be a traffic jam below or above you and you can still move at a good clip. And where they were not able to do that grade separation, public transportation kind of lost that battle, and slowly the cities became more and more for automobiles, about automobiles. And I think that even if there is a little core, even if there's a little in the heart of the town, if there is some grade separated, high capacity, rapid rail, fixed guideway system available, I think that really, really helps.
Thank you. But of course, we are doing all of this in a time frame or in a context where the time frame of generational change is not available to us. We've got to move incredibly fast, and we've got to get it right from the get-go, not just because of climate change, but also because of climate justice and equity. Seble, talk to us about what the equity dimension means for the work that you do and how you see active transport versus public transport emerging across Ethiopia.
Thank you. Yeah, I think finance is really key for any sort of justice-based recovery for energy systems and for transport. I think we're all in agreement when we think about what a just transition or a just recovery looks like. It obviously, fossil fuels are a legacy of the past, but there are about $5 trillion of public money that are funding fossil fuels and fossil fuel subsidies. So these subsidies are really in essence financing planetary dystopias. And of course, the transport sector is really embedded in this because it represents around a fifth of global emissions, and the vast majority of those are coming from road vehicles. So I think there needs to be a massive shift in this public money. Instead of continuing to pump into fossil fuel subsidies, rather promote what just transitions can be towards renewable energy, and really led by frontline communities that are at the helm of these extractive frontiers to power vehicles and to fly planes that are really part of a world that we want to leave behind. And instead move towards more collective economies that are grounded in climate justice and renewable energy. And I think there's so many different amazing proposals on the table, especially coming out of the pandemic. And these are really essential for transport systems because it doesn't exist outside of any of these more broader systems for justice. And for examples in the pandemic, it means, are there even active mobility networks existent for people to move if they're afraid to be on public transport? And especially in Ethiopia's context, if that's the majority of the way people are moving, this needs to be accelerated and incentivized. Or it means, can an essential worker get from A to B? Or are there bailouts for these systems of transport services, for example, so that people, are not losing all of their income to try and move within this pandemic? So I think we can be really intentional in this moment about if the bailouts are continuing to finance sort of these urban transport worlds that we're dreaming of, or if we're going to kind of fall back, because we all know that this is a turning point where a lot of the more glaring inequalities are really upfront and personal. And in my opinion, but I think this is relatively shared, we shouldn't have any more pennies of bailouts for fossil fuel subsidies. Instead, this can be a moment where there is so much funding of shifting from the fossil fuel subsidies towards mass electric public transport networks or active mobility networks that can really change how people are able to feel safe and connected moving in their cities.
Thank you for that passionate appeal. And I so wholeheartedly agree with you that any subsidy for burning more fossil fuels needs to be abandoned today still, this afternoon still, because it is silly that we continue to do so. But that to some extent could justify a whole other conference, right? Pascal, I want to come back to you here before I bring back the colleagues of the other part of the panel. You can see from the conversation we're having here, my time this morning, that we learn from each other if we talk across the different stakeholders, and yet bringing different parts of the ecosystem together is not always easy. What do you see as the biggest issues and challenges to foster that collaboration between companies and public authorities that you've been talking about?
Well, I think you just said the right words. It's just because we all share together. We are curious about each other. That we will raise common interest and we will find solutions. I think that knowing and understand each other, it's absolutely essential. It is not easy because we are all different, but it is because we are different that something new, that something incredible will happen. It can be done through what we call in Movin on communities of interest. It's a group of people from very different horizons, from global organizations, from private companies, from NGOs. They all gather around a main issue that is well identified, that is not too big, but not also too small, that can be easily tackled with concrete actions that can be achieved in a very short time frame, that makes things visible. And what are the kind of things that can be achieved? It can be technological prototypes, it can be business prototypes, whatever. But people can understand what we mean. They will play the role of examples because they are inspiring. They will incite people, they will incite all of us to move forward. And we think it is extremely important. We have a strong collaboration moving on with SlowCat. We have achieved tremendous things so far. We know each other, and we're working, and I was mentioning that we work together on a common forum of ACT. This is extremely important, and so collaboration is all about it. And as you were speaking just before, I was going to PowerPoint and make a rectangle in green, a rectangle of blue, and what is the mixed color of blue and green? I don't know, but maybe that could be the color of the next, arena for discussion at COP26.
Wonderful, Pascal. I must admit that I am colorblind between green and blue, so I certainly can't answer your question. Good. I am asking Heather Thompson and Edison Broce to rejoin this panel. Secretary Blumenfeld unfortunately had to move on to his next engagement, but we're bringing back Heather and Edison for the final wrap up here with all of us. And I have one question for everyone, and I'm going to go through the panel in order. One question for all of you, and that is, put yourself forward by 12 months. We are, after all, en route to COP26. Put yourself in the mind of being in November 2021 at COP26, probably on the main stage in that blue zone, Pascal, as you were referring to. What is the one thing that you would like to announce? What is the one thing that you will achieve over 2021 that will signify from the remit of your work a contribution to scaling up the transformation of transport and mobility for climate action and social equity? And Heather, I'm going to give you the hard challenge to start first.
I always find it hard to give just one answer, so I'm going to give one answer with three parts. First, I hope that we will have much more investment, much more financing in public transportation. Again, electric buses and charging infrastructure. I saw some conversation in the chat about the potential of rail versus buses, and I know that's a big debate. But I think people often underestimate the importance of buses and how buses, especially bus rapid transit, which is essentially light rail where you use dedicated lanes, just like rail, and buses instead, much more cost effective, which can drive as much investment in transit-oriented development as light rail. So first is investment in public transportation, but also seeing many more cities adopting policies like we see in Addis and so many cities around the world to really promote safe walking and cycling infrastructure and policy. We will be launching a campaign early next year to help support cities learn from one another, our Cycling Cities campaign to help cities learn from one another, be inspired by one another to invest more in cycling and walking infrastructure. As we said earlier, it's not something that comes free. It's not as expensive as light rail, but you still need investment and you still need support. And then lastly, more car control measures, which can also be a source of revenue for cities. So those three with national support for cities to do the right thing.
Fascinating how if you focus on vehicles, miles traveled and getting people out of single vehicles, you can make one into three. Wonderful. Thank you, Heather. Edison, what is the one thing that you'd love to say on stage at COP26?
We're running out of time and we need to take strong measures and make change happen to accelerate it. So I would definitely love to see the work we're doing in Panama with the bill on e-mobility to be passed. And I think that will be a great opportunity to send the right signals that Panama is already on the trend, is already prepared, and it enjoys other competitive advantages, if we can call it that way, on stability in different areas, politically, economically, and I believe it could be a fertile land for investment, for economic activity, for new opportunities, to boost new careers, to get young generations more involved. So that's exactly what I would definitely want to announce in a year's time. And I believe developing countries can also play a great role in these global efforts, just as this is being mentioned in the previous panel by Sebo. I was pretty impressed how Ethiopia has been able to work on amazing things. So I believe this is an opportunity for everyone, and emerging economies can also champion change. Back to you, Jules.
Super, thank you. Pascal, you came up with the idea of taking over the Blue Zone. So you have the whole stage of the Blue Zone a year from now. What are you going to be announcing?
Yeah. Well, you know, my dream for in a year from now would have to have some awesome examples of collaboration between civil society and companies, and concrete action to show that we can go further, make examples, make people dream again, make people realize that everything is possible. And finally, maybe that there's a single color. That would be my conclusion, single color for next COP.
Wonderful. That sounds like a very good announcement. Projjal, hopefully by the time COP26 rolls around, New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority is back in the swing of things post-COVID. What would be the thing that you would love to announce at that point?
So I have to, I would be remiss not to say that I'm here actually thanks to the UITP, which is the International Affinity Group of Public Transportation Networks based in Brussels. It is thanks to them that I'm able to share the stage with such wonderful people. And at UITP and also at APTA, which is kind of the America UITP, we have been working on something called transit avoided carbon. So this is actually measuring and quantifying what emissions are reduced through transit operations, from mode shift to congestion relief to land use factor. And I would like to see transit avoided carbon become a player, raise revenues, and at least in the United States, that we embark on a federal, a national level program, something akin to the Interstate Highway Act, but this time in the world of public transportation, this time in the world of removing people, taking them away from their cars, making the trips non-motorized. 12 months is a relatively short time frame, but I think if this kind of an intent can be expressed, that itself would go a long way, I think, in starting to drive costs down, much as has happened with solar and wind. As more and more people embrace it, costs come down, and we can see a use and prevalence of this. And of course, good public transportation becomes the underlying basis of bike, ped, of good cycling, of good livability, walkability, bikeability of our communities. So I think it's going to be a little bit slower, but hopefully we will at least put out a preamble in the next 12 months. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Seble, I come to you last. Not because you have not been incredibly eloquent, but as the youngest person, so much of what we all do is in service and in recognition of the fact that we have to safeguard the planet for your generation. So you have the stage, COP26, everybody listening to you. What would be the announcement that you would like to make?
I think I really want to stress that Ethiopia's modal shares of massive sustainable mobility majority are not idyllic because the whole population is tuned into IPCC projections on the climate crisis or the need to decarbonize everything within the next 10 years. It's out of dire economic necessity and not by choice. So I think there needs to be massive work to have strong infrastructure for these modes in which most people move. Because there needs to be a retention and also an expansion of these sustainable modal shares within circumstances that actually make pedestrians and cyclists and wheelchair users feel safe and prioritized and connected to thrive in urban public space. And I also wanted to tag on to what Edison and Heather had said earlier, that there needs to be extensive cultural work in shifting these aspirations at a global level through the media and the arts and pop culture to really leave cars behind and make active mobility networks and mass transit systems part of our immediate future. So in 1 year's time, I would love to see hundreds of kilometers of protected cycling lanes and pedestrian walkways built across Ethiopian cities. that really reshaped the urban context. And I'd love to see Mangadleso grow to more cities with more frequency and more connectivity between the sites and become an everyday part of how our cities are shaped. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for listening to us. I think this has been an inspired conversation. Please join me in giving a virtual applause to our panelists who have inspired and informed us and hopefully driven us to action over the next 12 months en route to COP26. I now have the privilege to hand you over to the closing segment, gearing up to COP26, where we will start by listening to Her Excellency Rachel McLean, the Minister for the Future of Transport and Decarbonization of the United Kingdom. Once again, thank you very much, and the floor is to you, Madam Minister.
Hello. I am the UK Minister responsible for the decarbonisation of transport in the UK and the transition to zero-emission vehicles. I'm also supporting the COP President and the Transport Secretary with our COP26 zero-emission vehicles campaign. Firstly, I want to thank all those involved in organising this fantastic event over the past 3 days, addressing the key topics around transport decarbonisation. We've all been hit hard by COVID-19. While we rightly focus on fighting the immediate economic crisis triggered by COVID-19, we must not lose sight of the huge challenges of climate change. As we look to build back our economic systems, we must do so within a green recovery. To meet our shared goals of the Paris Agreement, we need an immediate peak and steep decline of global greenhouse gas emissions. We must decarbonise the global economy 3 to 5 times faster over this coming decade than we have over the last 2 if we are to mitigate its worst effects. By working together, we can make the transition faster, cheaper and easier for all. While the UK holds the COP presidency, we want to bring governments together to drive action across key sectors of the economy, with one of our priority focuses being on road transport. The transport decarbonisation challenge demands a step change in both the breadth and scale of ambition globally. We must act quickly to reduce emissions, improve people's health, create better places to live and travel in, and drive clean growth. In the UK, we are committed to going further and faster to tackle climate change, which is why we're developing a bold and ambitious transport decarbonisation plan to achieve net zero emissions across all modes of transport by 2050. Building on the strong domestic action we're taking through this plan, alongside negotiations of COP26, we are preparing ambitious international campaigns to accelerate the shift to zero and low carbon transport by bringing together governments, cities, industry, businesses and civil society. Global emissions from road transport are rising faster than in any other sector. Road transport accounts for over 10% of global emissions, as well as causing high levels of local air pollution. The growth of the global market in zero-emission vehicles is outpacing expectations, and some estimates project that they will make up over 50% of all new car sales by 2040. However, to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, we think 100% of new car sales need to be zero-emission by then. In other words, we need to double the pace of the global transition to zero-emission vehicles. Last month, the UK Prime Minister announced that we're taking decisive action by phasing out the sale of new petrol and diesel cars and vans by 2030. And from 2035, all new cars and vans must be zero-emission at the tailpipe. All vehicles will be required to have a significant zero-emission capability from 2030 and be 100% zero-emission from 2035. But our ambition doesn't stop there. We will also be consulting on a date for phasing out the sale of new diesel heavy goods vehicles and investing in freight trials to pioneer hydrogen and other zero-emission lorries. This is part of our efforts to accelerate the transition to zero-emission vehicles, and we are convinced that we can achieve more at global level if we act together. The UK is not the only country to take ambitious steps to accelerate the transition to zero-emission vehicles. Our good friends, the Netherlands, have committed to a 20 phase-out date too. France will ban all new combustion engine vehicles by 2040, Norway by 2025, and Spain are currently putting forward a 2040 phase-out date too. Subnational governments are doing the same. California and Quebec have announced a commitment to a 2035 phase-out date for petrol and diesel light-duty vehicles. And if we coordinate our efforts on these challenges, such as around the pace of the transition, innovation needs, charging infrastructure, and align our long-term visions towards a zero-emission future, we will bring costs down faster and make the transition easier for each of us. In the run-up to COP26, we are calling all actors in society to make ambitious commitments to decarbonise road transport. Governments can support this goal by requiring all new cars sold within their markets to be zero emission by 2040 or earlier. Vehicle manufacturers and investors can commit to making all the cars they sell and invest in zero emission. And businesses that own large fleets can contribute by committing to buy only zero emission vehicles and by joining the EV100 initiative. And civil society can support the campaign in calling for these commitments. This event has been a testament to the huge momentum around the transition. Throughout the sessions, we've heard how we can enable a transition to zero-emission cars, vans, and freight, why a green recovery in response to the pandemic is so vital, and we've discussed the importance of cooperation across governments and industry. By acting together, we can take considerable strides towards decarbonising our transport sectors, strengthening our economies, stimulating our job markets, reducing our carbon emissions and getting us on track to meet our Paris Agreement commitments. Thank you again to our friends in the Netherlands and all the partner organisations who worked hard to make this event a success. I look forward to working with you all as we head to COP26.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the final session of this wonderful En route event. My name is Nania Piek, and I'm the head of the Unit on General Policy of Sustainable Mobility of the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management in the Netherlands. Thank you. I'm sorry, there was a technical glitch, I think. I want to thank the Minister for her video and expressing, I think, the urgent need for a green recovery. As she said, it's essential that we decarbonize the transport sector even more and faster in the coming decade to mitigate the climate change challenges we are heading. For the first time, I'm very happy and honored to introduce our next and final speaker of this En route event, which is, I think, very good, called Gearing Up to COP26. It is, of course, Mr. Gonzalo Munoz, which is our United Nations high-level climate action champion for COP25. I would give a warm welcome to Mr. Munoz, and I would like to give you the floor with introducing maybe two questions. First, in your professional opinion, what do you think are the key prevailing challenges to accelerate transport decarbonization? What should we focus on? And second, which developments make you most optimistic towards a systemic transformation over the next decade?
Well, thank you, Nanja, and thank you to Slowcat and to the organizers of En route to COP26. I truly believe there are 4 dimensions of sustainable transport that definitely during this year have incremented and should allow us to understand how can we pave that optimism towards a system transformation. The first one is that we have learned how to move less and in order to do and obtain the same things that we obtained in the past while moving a lot, right? This has been the year of avoid under steroids. We have avoided, of course, much more than even what we wanted. The second element is that when it comes to transporting people, we have to, of course, move more people by kilometer. The third one is definitely use less energy by kilometer by person, and in that sense, definitely active mobility and everything that we've just heard about the possibilities of incorporating much more cycling and walking in cities is absolutely fundamental. And finally, the fourth element is to use clean energy per kilometer. And in that sense, electromobility and green hydrogen are showing a fantastic opportunities ahead of COP26 and beyond. When it comes to maritime and aviation, we see that the industry is stepping up to the challenge with some key industry actors that have announced net zero commitments that by 2050. We have heard about Rolls-Royce and Airbus that are doing some very concrete steps forward for the aviation sector, while the Getting to Zero coalition on the maritime sector is aiming for zero emission ships commercially viable by 2030. Also on the tech side, all signs point to zero emissions ready deep sea ships being in the water by 2024. So we can see how also the Poseidon principles are providing a framework for integrating climate considerations into lending decisions. And recently, an increasing number of industry voices are openly calling for a carbon price to even the playing field for zero emission fuels. That example should also have a very positive impact in so many other industries that depend on shipping and aviation for their full decarbonization. So, and in that sense, the largest challenge that we're facing is also connected to the current lack of ambition and action at the IMO. The industry is starting to call for change, but the regulator is dragging its feet. This needs to change. So it's important to see how transport is also so well related to other sectors and pushing and sometimes pulling the action. So we need to normalize in that sense those milestones to be achieved by the end of this decade. That is very important for even for the narrative of the champions. Like we just heard from Minister McLean, it will be not enough to have net zero targets by 2050. For those front runners, leaders in government, cities, businesses, finance, the ambition is, we would say, 100% of the sales of zero emission vehicle sales by a certain date. And we as champions are actively working for that date to be 2030 in buses, 2035 in cars and vans, and 2040 for medium and heavy duty vehicles. We know that the transport sector is so critical to have the emissions by 2030 and finally reach the net zero emissions by 2050. So we want to be more provocative with the idea around avoid, shift, improve. Our proposal is that we can change it to avoid, shift, zero. We spoke about that while closing our transport day at the Race to Zero dialogues. The key now is short-term action and commitments. We need to engage with partners across the entire transport industry ecosystem to push them to do their part and not point to the inaction of others as an excuse not to move themselves. In that sense, we believe that the climate action pathways clearly outline the required actions. So to make progress, we will need to leave behind incrementalism and start embracing exponential thinking. We really know that the key to our collective success will be partnership via inclusive multilateralism. That means cooperating among and within different sectors. That includes not only Minister of Transport, Economy and Health, but also businesses, investors, cities, regions, and of course, a broad spectrum of civil society. I am therefore delighted that this sector has been so incredibly successful in having this cooperative partnership, including through the Marrakesh Partnership, where the coalitions from a wide range of sectors are working together. And then there's an extra element of the Global South. The Global South needs to leapfrog to zero emissions. We cannot afford to have sustainable transformation only in Europe, US, and Japan, while having inefficient and dirty transportation in the rest of the world. So working in the South is absolutely key. I would encourage you to consider that. So let's make sure we work with leaders in Latin America, Africa, and Asia that are already leapfrogging. And finally, finance and international cooperation will be key. In Chile, as you probably all know, we have a great example with our zero emission buses.
Thank you so much. I think we can all agree with everything you're saying. And also, of course, it needs to be, we need to work together. We need to realize all these different parts of the problem, that it's not one sector, it's everything is connected with each other. And if we look forward, and if you have all the attendants now and all the attendees and panelists, can you give us some homework? What do we really need to do this next year to get to COP26 and to accelerate all this transition you are talking about? What should we do this next year?
I would say that the first thing that we have to do is take the learnings from this critical and tragic year in so many aspects, but there are so many learnings from COVID as those learnings will have the capability of redefining our lives and our cities, right? There will be some changes in the demographic dimension and structure that will define a lot on how we transport and hopefully on how we plan our cities. So that would be the first element that I would take into consideration. When it comes to shipping and aviation, I believe that we have the capability of having such substantial joint commitment to accelerate ambition by 2030 and resolve the chicken and egg problem. Ideally, with offtake agreements for one side, green fuels from airlines and ship owners committing to purchasing zero-emission ready ships and aircraft, as well as on the other side, the fuel producer committing to ensuring the fuel will be there, financiers providing favorable conditions, etc. Creating the ecosystem for that to happen. The technology is there. We don't have to wait for that. We also expect definitely a significant increasing number of net zero commitments under Race to Zero. And when it comes to electric vehicles, we expect to have leaders announcing very specific commitments and action plans, countries setting 100% zero emission vehicles, some cities starting by announcing zero emission zones, and of course, to have development banks committing to finance and specifically to have mechanisms to work with the global south. I know we have multiple success stories from stakeholders groups on strategic ways to decarbonize the transport sector. The challenge will be to win the narrative for transport decarbonization in short and midterm perspective, along with these industry leaders and civil society ahead of Glasgow. I'm absolutely sure we can make it.
That's really great. And I love the way you say we have to win the narrative. I think that is essential, and you can see it much more, of course, these days. But the commitment is key. Commitment from all the countries, commitment from cities, commitment from the industry as well. And if I can ask you then, if you are, how do we say that, a realistic optimist with a realistic, optimistic look towards Glasgow, what would you expect? What do you think is a good outcome?
I think that, as I just said, the number of commitments towards Race to Zero is one of the metrics that we're working on. The use of the pathways, I really look forward for leaders around the world to really incorporate in their recovery plan the pathways as one very concrete tool that has been developed in this radical collaboration way that is providing mechanisms for at different levels, from cities to national level, to integrate the solutions that we have. I think that it's time for us to stop to stop that narrative of chicken and egg, and on the other side, point fingers the ones that are not moving. As I said, the technology is there. There's no excuse, and citizens from all around the world are expecting for us not only to show that we have a capability of reaching agreements in Glasgow, or to set more commitments. In Glasgow, we have to show that we are changing the trajectory from a crisis to the net zero and resilient world that we all need.
Thank you. I think that is really optimistic, and I like that. And I think that's a very good message from our final speaker. We just have another 2 minutes, I think. So are there any final things you would like to add, or would like to give to us?
The element of how much of the transport sector is providing a very concrete, it's providing the solutions that are needed for other sectors, right? I think that there are few sectors that shows us the need of shifting from the silo way of thinking to one that is integrating the solutions. In that sense, we understand that, of course, we need the big players in each of the sectors, in this case, shipping, aviation, road transport, vehicles. But at the end, it's also about aligning the value chain that many times is integrated by SMEs all around the world. And in that sense, we're proud of having launched the SME Climate Hub as an opportunity for integrating those value chains all around the world. So I encourage also, whether it's about a city mayor or a government or a business, to incorporate that vision. Turn around, take a look of your value chain, set this condition of collaboration in your value chain with your providers, and start using the power of purchasing with this added value of net zero emissions committed by 2050, the latest. And in that sense, we will show how much of that goal will be achieved, not by single members or participants, but with integration of different actors in a value chain.
Thank you so much. I can not agree more. Of course, we need industry, we need big industry, we need champions, but most of all, of course, we also should not forget the role of SMEs and the whole value chain. I want to thank you so much for your contribution. It is, I think, a very comprehensive look at where we're going next year, and also towards the optimistic message. That's always good to close with an optimistic note. Thank you so much, Mr. Munoz.
Thank you, Nigel. Thank you again to En Route COP26.
Thank you. With this, we close the final session. I want to thank, of course, all the organizers, the panelists, attendees, and everybody who have been working so hard to make this event wonderful. Of course, I would like to urge all of you to stay tuned at our social media channels, #enroute to COP26. And of course, you will find some session video recordings and event reports coming out shortly. I want to wish you all a very pleasant evening. Stay tuned and hopefully see you soon. Thank you.